Our topic today is one that a lot of you have probably thought about or maybe even experienced directly or indirectly through your friends or family: failure to launch kids, adult children returning home. And there's a lot of reasons for this. Maybe they can't afford to live on their own. Maybe college isn't a good fit. Maybe they're dealing with mental health issues. Maybe they can't find a job. Whatever the reason, it's important for parents to create boundaries for their sanity as well as for the future ability of their children to be out in the world and be independent. So joining me today is a friend of the show, Dr. Hope Seidel. Hope, welcome to the program. She was one of my first guests in season 1. She's a longtime pediatrician who traded in her white coat to become a parenting coach after she witnessed so many of her patients and their families struggling to find equilibrium in their homes. So again, Hope, welcome to the program. And believe it or not, you were my third guest in season 1. That was January 2024. So we're coming full circle now. You are now in season 2, and I really appreciate you being on the show today to talk about this topic that I think it's a hot button issue for a lot of parents. Is
I
that
agree.
something that parents are coming to you about?
Yes, I mean, the kinds of parents that I work with vary from all different issues, but failing to launch, kids struggling with boundaries, and our older children is certainly on the list of things that I work with parents for sure.
And I think we think parenting is 0 to 18. And then our kids get older and we go, oh, no, 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 no. It's a lifetime. This is one that came up again and again. And I did look up some stats on, how many adult children are at home. So the Pew Research Center says 57% of adults between 18 and 24 are at home. 1 in 3 adults between 18 and 34 live at home. And these numbers have not been so high in the US since the 1940s. And I kind of remember in our generation, tell me if you think I'm wrong, you turn 18, you go to college, you get a job, or you go in the military. There wasn't really like any middle ground. And I feel like now there's just a lot of kids that either leave and come back or aren't leaving at all. What do you think is going on?
Well, I think you made a good point originally when you were speaking to the fact that there's lots of different reasons why kids come home. And I do have a lot of opinions on why children are coming home and staying home. But I want to just clarify that my thoughts on this aren't appropriate for every kid. For example, sometimes kids come home because it's economically wise for them to build some financial nest eggs, or they have a job that's close to home and it makes sense. So not all kids are struggling with issues that come to me with my work and parents. But, I think number one, I mean, we make staying at home look quite appealing. In youth, we spend a lot of time in this generation doing things that are fun for our kids. They don't often have a ton of responsibility. We rescue a lot of them from doing things that are hard. We prioritize their activities over their commitments. I mean, when you were living at home, like there were things you had to do to contribute. A lot of parents in this day and age put a higher priority on the other things that are more entertaining. And, I think that we have limited our kids' capacity for resilience and independence by becoming a bit over involved as parents in our generation. And when you spend a lot of time because you really want to love and help your kids by helping them to be successful and telling them what to do all of the time, instead of allowing them to figure out a lot of their problems on their own, they don't build their capacity to believe in themselves and to solve problems that live and exist in the actual world. I think one of the things that I talk a lot about with parents is that we don't help our kids build self-efficacy, which is different than self-esteem. Like self-esteem is about your worth, but self-efficacy is a belief that you can do something in the world, that you can fail and that you can succeed, that you can get to a goal and achieve that. And I just honestly don't think our kids are having enough practice of that in the real world when they're living in our homes before they leave for college or jobs.
Yeah, and you mentioned the financial, and I think that is a big part of it. The Federal Reserve just did a study saying 1 in 7 Gen Zers are maxed out on their credit cards. And the Bank of America did a study saying 46% of adults between 18 and 27 are still getting financial assistance from their parents. And I'm going to admit, I have one in college and one working, and they both have some help, whether it's car insurance or phone or Uber or, they are getting help from us. So I think that is part of it. But I remember my dad saying, I can't wait to get you off the payroll. So are there financial considerations that can help create these guardrails and these boundaries for
Well,
parents and for families?
Well, let's just be honest. I mean, I don't know if this is true for you, but a lot of the times we're helping our kids because we don't want to feel uncomfortable with them not having what they need. And so let's just be honest about that. Like us giving our kids, my daughter could use money if I would give it to her. I just don't because I want her to live within her means and recognize that she made a decision to live in Manhattan and that is how much it costs. And so I don't send her any money. Does she need it? Yes. But what did she do? She got a babysitting job because she needs the money. And so a lot of times we give our kids financial assistance because they actually can't eat. But most of the time it's because we want them to live in a similar state of comfort that we created for them. And we want to really own that. Okay. That's not a financial need. That's a desire that we have for our kids to be okay. And so, and the other comment I'll make about credit card debt is I would be shocked. I mean, most adults have credit card debt. Our education for financial literacy begins in kids after they're on their own. And we really should be giving our kids financial guardrails to better understand how to handle economic issues as early as elementary school. I mean, there are so many critical skills that we don't give our kids to handle finances, to pay for things, to understand how much things cost, to wait, to learn patience, to value something that they have to wait for that we expect them to have the skill for when they get into the real world making their own money.
So let's say you do have a child that comes home for one of the many reasons we've talked about. What are some of the house rules? I mean, should they pay rent? Should you have chores? Should they have a date by which they intend to leave and be out on their own? I've even heard parents talking about having a contract with adult children to say, okay, this is a finite period of time. We'll give you 3 months, then you begin paying rent, and then 6 months you need to, get your own apartment or whatever it is. I mean, are those things effective and helpful?
If your boundaries are concrete. Parents sometimes are confused about what is a request or suggestion and what is a boundary, right? A boundary is if you don't get a job and pay rent, I'm going to make you leave. A boundary is if you want to stay here, I'm going to need $300 a month, or you're going to need to contribute to taking care of the home. It doesn't really matter what your expectations are, but they need to be decided ahead of time. A lot of resentment happens when we have expectations that our kids should know what they're supposed to be doing, or we have hopes and expectations, a wish that they would get it together or get a job or leave at a certain time, but we don't adequately communicate those expectations to our kids. And that builds a great deal of resentment. Sometimes we have kids that are making bad choices in our home. There's a lot of parents that I deal with who have kids who are smoking marijuana or staying up gaming at nighttime. Probably the most vulnerable group of kids that are living at home are young white males. And a lot of those kids are really struggling. And many of the kids that stay home are wrestling with mental health issues. And it feels really hard for parents to set boundaries because the cost of doing that can sometimes feel worse than, right, than committing to the rules of the house. So we just have to get crystal clear on what's important to us. And there's not really a right. I mean, what would I do? Of course, I would have a lot of boundaries on what was okay and not, but you have to be willing to enforce them, which sometimes means asking your child to leave. And if you're not willing to do that, then you're just making a request that you don't really mean you're going to follow through with.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of like when you're disciplining young children too, right? If you say if you don't,
Right.
I'm going to take this away if you do this, and if you don't take the thing away, they don't believe you. So
That's right.
it becomes ineffective. Um, are there times where you need to tell an adult child to leave? For example, if they are bringing drugs into the home, if they aren't following house rules, if they refuse to contribute. I mean, are there times really tough love needs to be part of it?
Well, I think that I like to think of it as good suffering, right? Like to me, at some point, there is a time when setting a boundary and holding our kids to that allows them to get the self efficacy and independence that they are uncomfortable having. And if we don't have a belief that they can do it, if we don't have a core belief that they have the capacity to fly on their own, they're going to borrow our belief, right? And we want to show them with our own words and our own hopes and our own actions that we believe that they can do it, and we're going to hold them to that. Of course, I think that if you aren't smoking pot with your kid and that's not part of your family culture, if drugs in your home is a hard no, that's a perfectly reasonable boundary. But just what parents often do is they just ask, please don't smoke in our home, please go to bed at a certain time, please turn the TV off in the middle of the night, and then they're really frustrated when they're not getting compliance. Our kids are motivated when we have boundaries that we mean. And that doesn't mean that they like it. They just are likely to change more when they know what's going to happen when we do. So, anything that's putting your family at danger, I certainly want you to be paying attention to if you are putting yourself at financial risk because you're spending so much time spending money on your kids or managing their mental health. Some parents are really suffering while they're trying to take responsibility for their young adults.
Yeah, I mean, I think about that a lot because I think it really disrupts the family dynamic, right? So if you have other children at home, it can disrupt your marriage if you have different ways of looking and different ways of parenting. So it is not just for your child, but it's for your sanity and your family's sanity and for the other siblings in the home, right? To make sure that this person is not disruptive to everybody else.
Yeah, and I think we talked on my first episode briefly about the history that I had with an alcoholic in my home. And so naturally, being in an alcoholic marriage, enabling comes to mind in this conversation, right? Is just the role that we play when we're really wishing things were different and how we accidentally prop the people in our lives up who are not making decisions that are good for any of us. And it's just that, one of the things that I think is just so critical that we need to do as parents is stop being mad at our kids for showing up with behaviors that we are allowing, right? We can't always control the choices that our kids make, but we can always control how we show up and the rules that we have in our home that you're allowed to have, that you are entitled to communicate in a way that is well understood and then to hold firm on.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I want to circle back to something you said, about mental health. And I think there's been a lot written and a lot talked about that after the pandemic, a lot of young people were dealing with mental health issues based upon isolation, if nothing else. And you also mentioned white boys. What do you think it is about this generation and white young men specifically that are causing so much, mental health issues, dissatisfaction with life, being disenfranchised, being isolated, whatever it is?
I don't think there's one answer for that. I mean, it's certainly a multifactorial thing that's occurring. I'll reiterate what I said at the beginning of our conversation, which is, as parents, we have been part of a generation of parents that have spent a lot of time over protecting our kids from distress and teaching our kids that their happiness is a really high priority. And so a lot of kids get into the workplace or they get into the real world and they're not prepared for the 50% of life that is just generally not awesome. You don't get somewhere and everything's better. You and I both changed careers. There are things about it that are better now, and there are also 50% of it that's just not so great. And that is the way the world works. And so when we spend our kids' childhoods catering to their joy and their happiness, and then we're confused when they get in the world and they wonder, why am I not happy? It's really easy for us to understand why their mental health is compromised. And that is just one of many. I think the pandemic is a relevant metric for the change in mental health, but we have to give social media a huge, huge plug for the reason that's happening. Gaming, all of these things are dopamine hits for our kids that take them away from experiencing their own emotions. And when you feel sad or when you feel exhausted, you can just scroll or you can just game and not have to think about it. And the resilience, the emotional resilience that our kids need comes from not not depending on something, alcohol, gaming, any of those things for the hit of dopamine that makes their life feel better quickly, because what they're left with after the dopamine ends is the same half of their life that is always not going to be optimal.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that comes from maybe not having experienced working. I know our generation, again, not to go back to that, but the buck up generation, I was babysitting, I was walking dogs, I was watering people's plants, and then as soon as I could get a real job, I got a job. So I think working really teaches you how to meet the world, all of those jobs that we have when we're younger. And if you haven't experienced that, it's a pretty rude awakening to all of a
100%.
sudden realize that people aren't always going to be nice. Things aren't always fair. Sometimes you have to do things you don't want to do. You don't always get to choose what you do or what time you show up to a job or how long you stay. And those are pretty hard lessons to learn. And if they haven't learned them by the time they get out in their real job, it's got to be pretty frustrating. So I think that's probably part of it.
Brilliant. Yeah. And that circles back to my original comments, which is that we don't give our kids responsibilities at home that really allow them to build that skill. I mean, you can learn all of those things, except maybe having a boss that you don't know, from chores around your house. I mean, even just giving our kids chores and responsibility that we depend on, is a critical piece to them really understanding that work is actually not always fun. It's just something that we sometimes have to do. And so I think a lot of young people are, to your point, disenfranchised and unhappy when things just don't feel as good as they thought they would when they got out of college into the real world. And we can't blame them. I mean, of course they do. Like, I mean,
Right.
what would you
So,
expect?
so is there hope? Can we reverse this? If you have a child, um, or multiple children that are going through some of these things, what should parents do? What kind of resources should they seek out to help them navigate this? I mean, obviously,
One,
talking to somebody like you.
obviously, yes, but 100%. Like, not. Listen, everybody's brains have what we call some neuroplasticity to them. Everybody can learn new things. The work I do with parents, and the part that parents really need to clean up is their own issues with what it would feel like to us to hold a boundary when a kid is seemingly struggling. Our kids are going to borrow our beliefs when we believe that they can do something and we're willing to let them fail and be uncomfortable. They are likely to build the capacity and the skills that we want. And if they don't have the systems in place already, then we do sometimes have to create those for them until they get good at it. Yes, would it be great if you could go back in time and do them earlier? Yeah, but it's not always realistic. And it's never ever too late to teach someone what your boundaries are in your home, ever, and to believe in them, of believe what they're capable of, and sometimes making space for just listening for how hard it really is, and agreeing with them can sometimes be validating, because many of our kids are just confused, like something has gone wrong, that everything isn't happy all the time, and that's just simply the way the world is.
Yeah, I mean, that's good to hear that you can change the boundaries. In other words, maybe you didn't have good boundaries and now you're saying, well, that didn't serve me, that didn't serve my child, and now we're going to have to create some. And I heard one story and I thought this was really great where the parents charged rent for their child from, I think, 18 to 20 something. The child lived at home, went to school, worked. And when she moved out to get her first home, they handed her $33,000 because they had taken the money and they had
Yep.
invested it and they set it aside for her because they
Yep.
wanted to show her, look what you've built. You
Yeah.
created this. You were able to make this work and now you have this money to start your life. So, I do think it's never too late, but it's a hard message, like you said, to get through to parents because they're worried about what will happen to my child if I don't do this.
Yeah, I think it's just the wrong question, because what will happen to your child if you don't do this, if you actually don't hold a boundary, the risk is so much higher. Right now, keeping them under your wing, constantly rescuing them from their life is only teaching them to be dependent on someone else. It deeply affects their capacity to believe in themselves. And that's where mental health is built. Really good mental health depends on being able to count on yourself, right? And so, in some ways, it's backwards, right? Like, the very thing we think we're doing to save them is the very poison that keeps them from being successful. And I have seen countless stories like you described in my own work with parents, where they're just sure that if they set a boundary, everything's going to be catastrophic. And they'll come back the next week and say, you know what, I told her that she had to get a job, or I wasn't giving her any more money. And guess what? She found a job. Of course she did, because she needs to eat. Like, just like we did. Our
Right.
parents weren't waiting in the wings to rescue us from those decisions, and then we did.
Yeah, I think that's some great advice. Well, any final thoughts, Hope? This is such a big topic. I know it's hard to cram it all into one interview, but I feel like we've definitely covered a lot.
Well, my only comments will be that we've talked a lot about all the things that parents did wrong, and I just don't think that that lens is particularly helpful when we're trying to make change. All of us make tons of decisions for our kids that are often anchored in love and anchored in a desire to keep them happy and healthy, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that the discomfort is the cost of their growth. And so reframing what it means to love our kids, what it means to give our kids things as boundaries instead of money, or as limits instead of tons of privileges, or our home, is a way to love them in the most wonderful way if you're willing to see it through a different lens.
That's a great way of looking at it. Thank you so much, Hope. Really
You're
appreciate
welcome.
you sharing your expertise and appreciate you coming back full circle on my show, my second season in 2025.
I'm thrilled to be here. I'm so happy for you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks. Have a great day.